Thousands of people gathered to protest against the government's energy policy. Estimates of the crowd vary from at least 2,000 and up to 4,000 or 5,000 according to organisers, with a large number of today's protesters coming from numerous anti-wind turbine and anti-pylon groups from all around the country. In a moment we'll be talking to some of the protesters and those in favour of wind energy, but first this report from Richard Downs.
Dublin today, and there was no mistaking the passion, all objecting to plans for electricity infrastructure where they live. The protesters came to Dublin to make their voice heard on a range of topics. Some were opposed to wind farms, others interconnectors, but the vast majority wanted to show their opposition to pylons. Even as the politicians in the Dáil were debating the decarbonising of our energy future, a new grouping was heading there, keen to remind them that building wind turbines near their homes and expanding the grid by building new pylons would not be a risk-free option.
From the South Kildare group, I think it's been completely flawed from start to finish, because the first that anybody really heard about it was when a local group of enthusiasts who kind of came across this started inviting us to meetings, etc. We weren't informed by our local politicians, we weren't informed by EirGrid. We're not talking about not in our backyards. Most of us live alongside the M9. We've got gas pipelines. I mean, right at the back of my house, the gas pipeline runs along. I've no issue with that. If this is needed for Ireland, it's needed. But there's been no discussion about whether it is needed for Ireland and why can't it go underground.
I don't think they have given a proper appraisal of all of the alternatives and all of the options. Just to come with pylons and voltage lines of 400 kVA, I don't think is being truthful of all the options that are available to them. So I think if they're open and honest and tell people what the options are and give them a proper and full appraisal, well then they'll have a lot more respect from the people on the ground.
Wind turbines remain unwelcome in some areas.
So the problem is these wind turbines are far too close to people's houses. That's the real problem. The other problem with this too is it's not democratic. The county council said no, we all said no, yet it's still going ahead.
Underlying much of the protest is a deep distrust of the people in power, the decision makers.
There's no need for all this pylons and turbines, it's just supply the UK. Totally unnecessary. It's just big business taken over again, and we don't want to see the countryside of Ireland ruined.
But they've actually said that the deal with the UK is off, it's not going to happen.
You can't trust the politicians, can you? I mean, there's an election coming up soon, anything could happen.
We say no! We say no!
John Downing, political correspondent of the Irish Independent, a substantial crowd there, but many concerns that they have, not just one simple issue.
Yes, a feeling that the opposition have been trying to play up here for some time, of two Irelands, an Ireland beyond the greater Dublin area, where the authorities aren't listening to ordinary people's concerns, and an argument that they are being bullied on various issues which affect their daily lives, pylons, wind turbines, and so on.
Are they right to be concerned about the plans that are afoot for wind turbines and for the pylons?
The wind turbine issue, while it exercises people quite a lot, it is perhaps less likely to happen now, at least on the scale that it was mooted. The pylons is very much a longer term project, but we have to remember that on Thursday of this week, nominations for local and European elections close, and that certainly ups the tempo and sees people voicing their concerns.
Some of the political heat has been taken out of this issue by the shelving of the wind energy export deal, and the Minister has put in place an eminent body to tease out the options for the new grid lines. But communities are mobilised, and the issues raised show no signs of fading away.
That was Richard Downs reporting there. Will join us in a few moments after the break, and we're going to be speaking to some of those protesters and those in favour of wind energy. back to the programme. I'm joined now by Oisin Coughlin, Director from Friends of the Earth, and Paula Byrne from Windaware Ireland. You're based in Ballyroan in County Laois. First of all, just before the break, we saw there the protesters in town today protesting against the government's energy policy. Why were you out protesting today, Paula?
Well, wind energy is incapable of any meaningful reduction in CO2. Wind is intermittent. It produces electricity for it produces no electricity for about 70% of the time, and for the 30% of the time it is producing, it requires a permanent backup source of power running, gas and coal in the background, ready to ramp up for when the wind fails. Now, Windaware Ireland, the group I represent, is calling for a full cost-benefit analysis of this government's policy. We need to know what are all the costs, what are all the benefits of this policy, and then to decide whether this policy represents a net benefit to society or a net cost. So if the cost is the destruction of the landscape, but we are saving the planet, that's one thing. If we are destroying this country for no good reason, that's another matter altogether, and I think the people are not prepared to roll over and accept that, as you saw today.
Okay, Oisin, what's your response to that?
I'm afraid it's simply not the case that wind doesn't reduce CO2. We saw in the last couple of days the UN panel on climate change come out and say that if we're going to have a good chance of staying under 2 degrees of global warming, we have to triple or quadruple renewable energy around the world. And that study was put together by 400 authors and reviewed by many experts and signed off by 194 governments. They didn't just make up the fact that wind has a really major role to play in decarbonisation. And if you look here in Ireland, in December it's normally the highest CO2 impact from energy. This year it was the lowest ever because we had a very windy month. We had 20% of our electricity came from renewables in the last figures we had. It's making an impact on CO2 and it's not raising costs.
Well, I would say that Oisin is quite long on aspiration but short in facts and figures, because if Oisin tells me that wind is needed in the mix, I really need to see the evidence, because I think we're gone way beyond blind faith. And I would ask Oisin and your viewers to have a look at our website, windawareireland.com, where we cite over 110 reports on this issue, and we've had to read them ourselves. Now, one of those reports is from Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, which has analysed renewables in Ireland and found that after 20 years and billions invested in wind energy, we are saving 2.3% of fuel savings because of wind, and that doesn't even account for this spinning reserve, this up and down of the conventional sources of energy.
Just on the spinning reserve, first of all, it doesn't. When I heard this phrase first, it doesn't have anything to do with turbine spinning. It's the backup we need for all our energy sources in Ireland. And at the moment, the case in Ireland is we don't need any more spinning reserve for wind than we do for anything else. Having wind in the system is not increasing our need for that. No energy source is perfect. Paula mentioned wind is only producing energy 30% of the time. All our other plants, peat and coal, are at maximum 50%. All of energy needs some form of backup. And we will save 4 million tonnes of CO2, 35% reduction in CO2 from energy if we keep putting renewables onto the system. It's already delivering 20%. It's not a notional study. It's practically happening here in Ireland. And again, I have to go back to the IPCC. They didn't just make up the fact that wind is one of the major resources we have. And Ireland has one of the richest wind resources in the world. If we're going to do our fair share in climate change, we have to make use of it.
And actually, Paul, just to say that, even Mary Robinson yesterday morning was saying this in Morning Ireland, we all as citizens, I suppose, have to play our role. Absolutely. And wind is the one area, I think, many people believe in Ireland, where we can focus on renewables and make our role, I suppose, in some way, citizens of the world.
Yes, absolutely. And we fully believe we are facing a global crisis, and we need to find real evidence-based solutions. The IPCC report also said that fracking had a place in carbon reduction. So, just because the IPCC report says that wind has a place, and if I could just go back to the evidence, there's very little, there are very few reports that are based on real-time data, but one that is, and it's based on EirGrid's own figures. If you go onto EirGrid's site this minute, it will tell you what energy has been produced from what source and what CO2 emissions are on a quarter-hourly basis. Now, this study was conducted by Fred Udo. He found that over a several-month period in 2011, when wind produced 12% of our electricity, we saved 4% of our carbon. When wind produced 34% of our electricity, we saved 6% of our carbon.
Okay. I think Paul has put her finger on a real choices we have. The choice is not between wind or no wind. The choices are between wind or fracking or nuclear. The bottom line is we have to come off fossil fuels, off peat, off coal, and ultimately off gas from fracking as well, and move to renewables or low carbon energy. That's the choices we're facing. I totally agree though, we need much more public participation, much more community participation, and indeed in Germany 50% of the renewables are owned by communities themselves. That's the sort of participation.
But we're going to have to choose something, whether it's nuclear or fracking or wind. We're going to have to choose one of them, aren't we, Paul?
Well, I don't think those are just three choices. There are many, many choices. Wind either works or it doesn't work, and we need that analysis. Okay, we definitely do. We had our launch of Wind Aware Ireland last Thursday, and attending on our panel was Don Moore from the Irish Academy of Engineering. So one of the prime sources he found was biomass. He suggested biomass and converting some of our stations already to biomass. But it doesn't matter if wind either does work or it doesn't work, and we can probably only have a small amount of it in the system before it fails to work.
Well, we can have 40% wind on the system by 2020. The capacity is there, and indeed the plans are there. We do need much more community participation and indeed much more community ownership of renewables for it to be something that we all gain from.
Okay, look, we'll come back to it. We've done this
you.
many times in Prime Time, we will. Paul Byrne,
Thank you
Washington
very
Coughlin,
much.
thanks very much. Claire.